So, Saskia, I was at a barbecue at the weekend and there were some guests that turned up, maybe slightly more guests that were anticipated by the hosts. And these maybe slightly larger number of guests proceeded to eat the vast majority of everything that was put out there to the point where it was a bit excessive. So, my question is, have you ever done anything to excess in that way?
Well, I mean, I rode a horse a few times and within a very short space of time ended up buying one. So that might have been a bit excessive and over the top. Yeah, I know. I mean, there was some consideration and thinking behind it. It wasn't that crazy, but looking back at it, I was like, oh, I really did just
Buy the biggest animal you could find.
Yeah. I was like, you know what, Jack Russell, too small. Let's think bigger.
Hello, I'm David Ewell, and I hope it's me you're looking for, as I'm back with another episode of AHDB's Agonomics podcast. This show's been going for 11 whole months, so we've got a back catalogue that could keep you occupied all night long. All night, if you choose to spend that time brushing up on the economics of agriculture. This week, I'm joined by our lead environment specialist, Saskia van Dongen, to discuss Defra's land use framework. The aim of this concept is to inform and improve decision-making on how land is best used and managed to achieve Defra's land use vision. A 12-week consultation period recently ended, during which we raised 5 key points for consideration, with the framework due to be published later this year. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to this show wherever you stream your podcasts to make sure you don't miss an episode. Wednesdays are a dancing on the ceiling kind of day, as that's when new shows drop at midday. And please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or send us an email, agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. So this is the normal point in the podcast where we talk about what's been going on. Has anything been going on in agriculture in the world recently? How about a US-UK trade deal that wasn't really a trade deal, it was more just an agreement on some tariffs just to kind of get a few things through, wasn't it? But key things out of that, the key impact from agriculture is the access to the market for US beef, the reciprocal market access, and the access for US ethanol to come into the UK. Now, let's start with the ethanol one. And this is something that's a bit of a question, because obviously from a UK perspective, we have a very, very viable bioethanol industry with Ensus and with Virgo, the two main sources of consumption, and a huge amount of feed wheat that goes into those two consumption points. There's quite a few questions out there at the moment in terms of what actually the trade deal is. It's been described as an existential threat to UK bioethanol production, which I think I would agree with. And the view from the bioethanol sector is that it's such a risk that it may lead to some closures of plants. And obviously, if that happens, that's going to be a considerable reduction in domestic demand to the entirety of the East Coast feed wheat market. Drastically changes East Coast of England feed wheat market, and to an extent up into the borders of Scotland as well, and will mean that there's more wheat on the market, is likely to lower the delivered price into Yorkshire and therefore lower ex-farm prices throughout the east of England and even into the centre of England as well. It's something that's a great concern to the industry, but I still think there's quite a few questions that are out there. I know that some questions have been posed to the government as to whether we are talking about ethanol or bioethanol. We really need to understand the specifics of what has been agreed to understand what the impact will be. It's a bit of an open one and yet to be defined, but evidently is a risk. If we do get to the point where there are closures of the bioethanol plants across the East Coast, then that is a negative impact on price. And it isn't just wheat prices as well. There would be the reduction in the high protein distilled dried grains animal feed that comes out as a byproduct from the process, and also a reduction in the availability of CO2, which goes into a huge range of industrial processes, but obviously into slaughter, stunning, food packaging, etc. So the knock-on effects of this could be wide-ranging, but we do need to understand the details. So that's one complicated thing that we've got to figure out. Here's another one: beef markets, beef access. It's a headline, I think, that was put out there, obviously, that the US now has, now reciprocal access. So, UK has access to the US beef market, US has access to the UK beef market. That's, if anyone didn't know what reciprocal meant. There we go. This isn't just economics. This is grammar and English as well. Personally, I don't think it's going to have a kind of a huge immediate impact on the beef market. There might be an opportunity for exports going over to the US. I think really, I suppose our concern is that there would be some US beef coming over here, which I think would happen, but we don't think it's going to be awash with US beef, specifically because of the growth hormone treatment and how that won't be allowed. But again, it's difficult to then understand how the supply chains work to how that'll be cleared out. Argentinian beef is also pretty predominant in the market at the moment. Is this going to materially replace that is a question. You know, there's quite big price differences between them. I know we're talking about, what is it, a £27 tariff that's being taken off, but we need to understand the price differences between global origins before we start figuring it out. But obviously, if you are a Texas steakhouse restaurant, you are going to have a vested interest in putting US beef on the menu because that is your brand, that is your marketing ploy. But for a generic food service and for retail, unless there's significant price discounts that makes US super competitive, then we don't feel that currently the market dynamics in play, that there would be a huge amount of beef that would come in. But it does set a precedent. I think this is kind of the more longer term worrying thing. We're talking about existential threats to bioethanol. Is this another existential threat to the beef market and to agricultural markets as a whole if we're willing to allow these concessions to be made? It may not be the cliff edge, but does it set a precedent for future trade negotiations? And the expectation that as we go through this month, there is going to be sort of announcements around how the UK and EU are going to discuss their trade agreement going forwards and whether there is a Brexit reset that happens. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff. I think trade and trade deals and standards is going to be a big thing that will happen over the coming months. And it doesn't just have an overnight impact. This is one of those ones where it's a longer term impact. So we'll have to view and keep an eye on it as time goes on. So I think this podcast today is going to be about complicated things because we've just been talking about US-UK trade deals. Now we're going to go on to something which could potentially take us into a whole world of different things we could talk about. But we're going to be focusing on the recent consultation from Defra around its land use framework. So joining me on the podcast today is Saskia van Dongen. So this is AHDB's lead environment specialist. So if we're talking about land use, Saskia's the person that's going to know what we need to know. So Saskia, welcome to the podcast. Can I start by asking you a very simple question of what was the consultation? What is the land use framework? What was all this about?
Yes, good question. So the framework is a tool that will help decision makers that have anything to do with land to make a decision that will work towards Defra's vision. And it's all about being able to make space for nature recovery, but also sustainable and resilient food production, to deliver on new infrastructure and housing. And this framework is kind of that base of how do we get there when we're thinking about this finite amount of land that we have. The framework will, when it's kind of being published, it will have principles, it will have policy levers, it will have decision support tools. But what the consultation was really about was kind of that base of what is the foundation of this framework, what has gone into it that will then shape what we're then going to use to decide how best to use our land. So there was a bunch of data that went into that, scenario modeling, economic analysis went into it, and that was kind of presented in this consultation. And then we had 12 weeks to kind of look through it, pick it apart and see how, if we put that all together, if we can then see this framework reaching that vision.
Well, that sounds easy. Let's sail on and we'll talk about... Well, no, before we go on, let's talk about I suppose, the bigger picture of this, because this is something that's interesting when we think about exactly what the government is trying to achieve. And this links into a lot of different things that are happening. This can't be seen in isolation, in my view, that this is part of a package of things. It's almost trying to set the guidelines and I want to use a cheesy word there, like roadmap or something like that, to sort of describe where we're going to be going, not just from an agricultural basis, because obviously this is broader than agriculture with the land use, because as you said, you've got house building and other things that are a part of it as well. This is linking agriculture, food, how land is used, and also from a consumer perspective, there's some kind of like broader macroeconomic stuff that sits in with it as well. This is very much trying to be a package of things. So you've got the land use framework. I mean, alongside it, you also kind of need a longer term food policy. And then, as you say, you need all those like strategic levers and the policy levers that sit behind it to make it all happen. This isn't one of those things from a land use framework, in my opinion, that is just going to be the done deal and this is the Bible that we all work to and everything kind of filters from there. This is almost sort of one part of the jigsaw. It's a pretty significant part of the jigsaw, albeit, but there is more that needs to be added onto this. It kind of leads into bigger conversations when we start talking about if this is the direction of land use, then that's going to set production potential to go in one way. It's going to set environmental impact to go in one way. This is where I suppose we go big macroeconomic kind of view of agriculture, of everything, that this is looking at the bigger picture. This isn't something that's just going to be fixed within a parliamentary cycle. This is something that realistically is setting us on, as you say, that sort of 25-year plan. And I think that's the critical thing, is if we start on that 25-year plan, we need to stick to it. We can't be chopping and changing as we go through every 2 or 3 years and making different decisions, because you'll never get anywhere with that. So this I think this is why it's really important, that we can't just treat it in isolation. We've got to think it is the bigger picture with everything else.
No, absolutely. And it's, the cheesy roadmap word, 25-year farming roadmap's going to at some point be published. We've got a food strategy, like you said, there's a lot that this is going to fit into. And I think that this framework is a tool that brings it all a bit together. We've got net zero at 2050, which again is not just agriculture. It's so many different sectors that all have to work towards that. And one of the key elements of achieving all of these big goals is land. And we only have so much of it. And I think that this framework will bring it all together. The question is, though, is how impactful will it be? So it's voluntary, it's guidance, it's not a mandatory document. And based on how the kind of devolution agenda that is kind of currently going forward, how that actually moves forward will impact how meaningful this framework will be. Decisions are being made in government, but also local, regional, and, by land farmers and land managers themselves. So that's kind of why it's so important, and why, depending on how this devolution agenda moves forward, it will have a different impact.
I suppose the main thing we want to talk about, obviously, that's why we're here. That's the reason for it. That's kind of what it is. But the consultation went out, and we as AHDB have created a response to that. We published it at the end of April, and all available on our website. So just go on the website and just bang it in the search and you'll find it. And there were 5 key points which we identified within our consultation response. And I think it's probably worth going through those now, just to sort of take a bit of time to explain them, because some of them, I suppose, may sound quite obvious and simplistic, but there's quite a lot of depth to them. So the first one of those, the first key thing that we pointed out, was that this framework has to have clear, actionable outcomes, which is based on robust data. Now, we're not saying immediately that it's all a load of rubbish and the data's a load of rubbish, but what we are saying is we need to ensure that however we go forwards with it, that the data that we use, the assumptions that we use are completely clear, as strong as they can be. Otherwise, there's a risk, and again, this is me slightly oversimplifying this with my language, there's a risk that we're just setting ourselves up to fail if we don't use the right data from the start.
Absolutely. It's about not using data that's based on averages on, for example, a national average, but that it's granular enough to really pick up that local level of land use, so that when people make decisions for their plot of land, it's the correct data to use and not based on a regional number or a national number. And I think that is very important. And also the clear actionable outcomes. It needs to be something that encourages people to take action and to think about it, and not that it's just some kind of vague document that no one really, it sounds really useful and it's a very interesting map, but what do I do with it? What next? So I think that is also where those clear actionable outcomes are so important. There's a lot to do in the next couple of years, and we need to support people with doing that and not confuse them.
And I suppose following on from that, when we're talking about, robust data and the value of data and making sure that we're starting off like that first foundational platform of everything is correct, there's then, I suppose, a deeper level of there within the framework where we're, a bit concerned about projected increases in yield, the productivity numbers that are put in there, as well as the calories per hectare used in the land use evaluation. I suppose what we wanted to make sure is that all of the assumptions and all of the data that's, from an agricultural perspective is, I suppose, reflective of what the real world is now and is achievable.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair thing to say. It's about making sure that that underlying data, saying we're saying we need local and not national average, but that it encompasses everything. So when you eat a meal, it's not just about the calories that you intake, it's about minerals, vitamins, everything else around that. So if we're just making decisions based on calorie per hectare, we're not actually looking at the full picture. So that was a real concern. And then again, the projected increase in yields and productivity, it's food resilience and sustainability is a very important part of it. The framework, or the consultation, says that it will be able to maintain food security, but it also is suggesting land to be taken out of production. So then the question is kind of posed to like, how is that then being done? So they've done a bunch of analysis around that. And though it has some very useful bits in it, we do question whether that yield increase that they project is actually as viable as they make it appear. Depending on the data and the start points that you take, yield hasn't had a significant increase over the past decade, I would say. So to suddenly just assume that with land taken out of production, with more farming practices being taken up that will possibly be better for the environment but produce less yield, and then still have that yield increase, yeah, we have a few question marks around that.
On the yield one, specifically, my view of it is if you look at yields over the last 5 years, you've gone from just an average wheat yield here, you've gone from low 7 tonne a hectare up to the best part of 8.5 tonne a hectare due to the climatic conditions that we've seen through the year. Those climatic conditions are becoming ever more extreme due to climate change. So how do you use and map in that potential yield volatility and climatic volatility into a model where you could see greater swings as climate change gets more extreme over a time period, and therefore you're trying to balance that potential volatility against saying you need to be making productivity gains and yield gains? It just kind of doesn't feel as if it all adds up. In a nice, clean kind of statistical world, then yeah, I get it. It kind of makes sense. You try to map a projection forwards and say that's where we need to get to. Yep. But given the real world impact of this, it doesn't feel as if some of that is particularly achievable.
Yeah, it's a bit too sterile. There's a lot more going on than just the production of it that will influence. So you've got like the climate and weather events that you've mentioned, geopolitical events that we don't even know may occur. So there's quite a lot out there that could pose a shock to the system and mean that projected increase won't actually occur.
Well, we're going to give our brains a bit of a rest there, and we're going to take a break now to get the latest from the markets. And when we come back, we're going to be talking more about these key points that we've identified that need to be challenged within this consultation.
Hi, I'm Helen Plant, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing Tuesday, 6th of May. Old crop wheat prices have continued to fall amid the uncertainty created by US tariffs and lacklustre global export demand as the season enters its final months. New crop prices have also come under pressure, but to a lesser extent, with NOV 25 UK feed wheat futures now trading in the low 180s per tonne. While dry weather in Northern Europe is a concern, timely rain has fallen or is forecast to fall in Southern Europe, Black Sea countries and the US, calming market nerves. Meanwhile, Harvest 25 Paris rapeseed prices have been pulled lower by expected rises in European and Ukrainian sunflower output this year, plus lower soybean and crude oil prices. Markets are now waiting for the USDA's first forecast of global supply and demand in the new season, out next Monday, 12th of May. This, along with currency, crude oil and changing weather forecasts, are going to continue to be key influences on prices in the weeks ahead. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to ahdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
AHDB's Planting and Variety Survey delivers UK planted area estimates for the upcoming harvest each year. The results offer an early idea of what might be available for the upcoming UK cereals and oilseed rape harvest, and this year will reflect the impact of what was a challenging autumn for many. But we can only do this with your help. If you're a UK grower, please take a moment to complete the crop and variety form for Harvest 2025. You may have received the survey through the post, in which case please complete and return it by Monday the 12th of May. Alternatively, you can fill in a form online. Just go to ahdb.org.uk/PVS25 and ensure it's submitted by Friday the 16th of May. The survey is open now and the results will be available on the AHDB website from the 10th of June. Thank you for your input.
welcome back to part 2 of Agronomics. Saskia is still with me talking about the land use framework and some of the points that AHDB have identified from that. We've spoken about making sure that we need to have robust data and that we've got some concerns around the basis for the projection and increases in yields, etc. But there's a few more specific things that we put in, Saskia, that I think is worth pulling out and probably worth just, I suppose, clarifying exactly what we mean. Because one of those points that we raised from this is saying that we need to have clear prioritisation rules regarding land use change decision making, and that should accompany the framework outcomes. What do we exactly mean by prioritisation rules?
We've mentioned that this is for food production, housing and infrastructure, nature recovery. By saying that, we kind of acknowledge that those are 3 key bits of land use, and we feel that that should be acknowledged. So agricultural land should be one of our key priority areas, environment should be one of our key priority areas, and housing and infrastructure, again, acknowledging it, 3 key priority areas. With that, when we then look at land use change decision making, we want to make sure that those 3 key priority areas are acknowledged, and that when we need land or land use change, it's not taken out of those 3 key areas. So really making the best out of the brownfield sites that we have, the marginal land along the side of the road, and also kind of making the most of, for example, golf courses. What can we do to kind of pack as much as we can into bits of land? Which, without stealing your thunder, leads very nicely to point number 4, on multifunctional land use change approach. So we want to make the most out of the land. So we don't want to just have a bit of land and only do one thing with it. Let's stack, let's do multiple things on this bit of land. And I think that agriculture is a beautiful example of that you're able to do so much whilst doing food production. You're also able to support biodiversity with, for example, your hedgerows, sequester carbon, flood resilience. So again, just making sure that with that bit of land we only have so much of it, we make the absolute most out of it and get as much benefit from it as possible.
That whole view of it and those 2 points that we've pulled out of it, I think, we talk about data being important, and that's always there. But I think having that multifunctional view and having that sort of, I suppose, more open approach, and not being just specifically blinkered, thinking agriculture is this bit and there's then a barrier, sort of like some kind of weird invisible line when a field finishes and a brownfield site starts, that actually, nature doesn't work in straight lines in that way. You can't just box things in. Having that view of it, I think, is really important. And I do think that there's an appreciation of that, but it's also then actually quite difficult, I think, to turn that into something that was an equal opportunity for everyone, because obviously each sector, each farm, each farming system is going to be completely different. Everyone is going to have, from a farming perspective, I'm talking here, everyone is going to have a completely different view of this based on the soil type on their farm, the geography of their farm. It's all going to be different. So we have to have that kind of, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Everything has to be fit in, but also at the same time, that doesn't, you can't then just say it's completely open. You have to put some guardrails around it. It does, I suppose this is why this is kind of an interesting thing to talk about, is because it's both huge in everything that it could potentially be, but it also needs to be very specific. And that's the challenge that we've got, of taking that huge element into something that's actually driving a specific change going forwards.
And I would say also that it's all about those, the little puzzle pieces from your very small farms that then together you get the entirety of England, and we'll work up and then have this complete puzzle where we'll reach, for example, the food security, the net zero, nature recovery, housing and infrastructure. It all works together. So yeah, making the most of everything that we have.
So we've kind of said this throughout, but we did make one final point, which was that this land use decision making, needs to incorporate climate resilience and take a long-term view. And we've been talking about this being sort of, the 25-year plans. Naturally, this has to be long-term, given the nature of what we're trying to achieve. But it's interesting from a climate resilience point of view, isn't it? And I suppose this is where there's a bit of a challenge in this, bit of an internal challenge, I suppose. What are we trying to achieve, and where's the balance? Is the best thing from a climate perspective that we follow this land use framework down to, I suppose, the extreme, and we start reducing production? Because from a climate perspective, it's good for our country, but that may not be good from a global sense, because if we are producing less and we're really good and really efficient and really sustainable, environmentally friendly at producing beef, for instance, again, coming back to when we were talking about US versus UK beef in terms of trade earlier, could we be producing more and being probably less favourable to our own environment in terms of what the utopian potential, the perfect end could be? But from a global sense, if we're producing more and exporting that, it's preventing, not in a really nasty way when I say this in terms of preventing, but it's preventing another country that is not as good as we are in producing it, that they don't have to produce as much because we're better at it, and therefore it kind of balances out. This is the tricky thing where you take this single view of looking at from our country perspective and you put it into a global context with trade, and it changes the dynamic around that climate thing completely again.
Yeah, it's tricky is probably the best way to put it. We could easily talk about this for another couple podcasts itself, but I would say that if we look just at England alone, I think flexibility is key with having this climate resilience. We need to make sure that we can adapt to extreme weather events, and with this land use, that the framework isn't too prescriptive of where we do one specific action, because in 5-10 years time, that land might not be suitable anymore. Climate change may have altered something and production may be actually occurring best elsewhere. I think that when we're looking more towards kind of the international stage, I think the UK is doing really well. I think England is doing very well with being able to move forward and take those steps towards sustainability. And I think that we could lead by example, and we can only make decisions on what we know now. And I think that's the hard thing when it comes to climate change, is that there's a lot that could suddenly happen that we're not aware of, and we can prepare for that as much as possible. But I think that we can't really make any decisions that are completely set in stone, because then we can't adjust and then we can't work towards or safeguard that food security, for example. I think the key thing with all of this really is that you have to have a vision of where you want to go. And the fact that we're having this on a sort of discussion on a national scale is a good thing. The fact that we're talking about integrating all of the different aspects, that it isn't just about land use, it's about environment, climate, it's about food security and everything as well, is a good thing. It's also having that understanding that this will morph and change over time. We can't set something that's fixed today and we go, right, we've agreed our 25-year plan, let's go for it. And then in 5-10 years, we're still trying to sort of, fight against the current to do that thing we agreed 10 years ago. This is going to be a continually changing narrative and a continuing conversation that we will have in perpetuity, but we have to have a place that starts. So I think having this conversation is fantastic. Saskia, thank you for your time. Thank you for your inputs today. For those that were listening intently, as ever, we were trying to put some song titles in. If you didn't get it in the introduction, I'd be very disappointed. Only one person has ever sang Dancing on the Ceiling, and that was Lionel Richie. There was some Commodore song titles in there as well. We all love a bit of Lionel, don't we?